Welcome to our event on Alibaba and lessons for broader U.S.-China business relations. This is a joint event with Asia Society Texas and Northern California. We are very pleased to have Brian Wong as our special guest speaker. He's going to give us behind-the-scenes insights into one of the largest companies in China and one of the largest companies in the world. Moderating today is Ambassador Frank Lavin, and I will be introducing him in just a moment. A warm welcome to our partner colleagues at Asia Society Texas. It's been a pleasure working with you on this, and a big welcome to our members at our 15 centers around the world. We appreciate everyone in the audience supporting our mission of navigating shared futures. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of Asia Society Northern California. We have an hour for this program. We'll finish at 8:30 p.m. in Houston. That's 6:30 p.m. here in San Francisco. For today's format, I will introduce our moderator, Frank. He'll introduce Brian Wong. They'll have a moderated discussion, and then there will be time for audience Q&A. So please do type your questions via the YouTube chat box whenever you would like. Frank will be monitoring that and get to as many questions as we can. This event is on the record and we are recording. The video will be posted to YouTube. Now, a few brief words about our moderator, Frank Lavin. He is the CEO and founder of Export Now, which works with global brands on e-commerce strategy and operations in China. He has served in the government, in the Department of Commerce, State Department, National Security Council, and White House. He served as Undersecretary for International Trade at the Department of Commerce. He was the lead trade negotiator for both China and India, and was previously U.S. Ambassador to Singapore. He has worked in the private sector too, at Edelman, Bank of America, and Citibank in Hong Kong and in Singapore. And we very much appreciate Frank being on our Asia Society Northern California board. Please welcome Ambassador Frank Lavin.
Margaret, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here this evening. It's great to reconnect with the Northern California Asia Society and Texas Asia Society. Very grateful for your support for hosting this today. So we're going to have a great discussion. I'm delighted to be back with my old friend Brian Wong, who I've gotten to know personally and professionally. As Margaret noted a minute ago, my company Export Now helps U.S. brands in China, mainly through Alibaba and Tmall and the family of outlets that Alibaba operates. So I know the professional side as well as the personal side. But Brian, you've taken it to the next level. You've given us a story of a company and a personal story and a journey of technology in China that sort of undergirds, to my mind, the whole transformation of China. And let's just begin this conversation by saying, welcome, delighted to be here with you. By saying, please share with us your insights, share with us what the book meant to you and the core themes that you learned in that book.
Well, thanks so much, Frank, for that introduction, and thank you to Asia Society Texas, Northern Cal, and Margaret for hosting this wonderful event. It's great to be back with old friends like you guys were mentioning, and have this opportunity to share the Tao of Alibaba. The story is really two stories within one, Frank. And on the one hand, it's about how Alibaba's founder Jack Ma created an organization which, like the Tao, is in constant state of becoming, adapting, and changing, but it has stayed faithful to a core purpose and steady set of principles along the way. The result being that this is an organization that has been able to recreate itself constantly, time and time again, over the last 2 decades. On the other hand, this story is about my own personal journey, moving from Palo Alto, California to Hangzhou, and realizing that there are many things in this process that I had to sort of unlearn, reassess, in terms of my beliefs about the role of business, what motivates people, and if and how Eastern philosophy and Western beliefs can really fit together and coexist within an organization. So in this book, Frank, I talk about sort of what are the external factors that created an enabling environment for a company like Alibaba in the digital economy as a whole, whether it be its large population, the social stability over the last 40 years, the infrastructure that was built, both physical and digital, that allowed for connectivity, in the world that they have today. Education, largest STEM graduate numbers amongst top in the nation, the entrepreneurial spirit, and many other factors, particularly the late touch governance sort of approach that the government used when allowing these tech companies to innovate, experiment, and then blossom into what they are today. The other aspect I address, though, is also how Alibaba was a catalyst for this burgeoning digital economy. Alibaba played such a key role in developing the e-commerce sector, digital payments, as we know, big data, cloud computing, and finally, logistics. All this provided the 4 pillars of what is now the foundation of much of the digital economy that we see today. I also point out how Alibaba was driven not just by the business, aspects, but also by this mission that was really trying to figure out how to solve society's problems. And I go into kind of how this happens, both in terms of the e-commerce business, job creation, but also creating a more inclusive economy, bringing in marginalized or underserved communities into the mainstream economy. But then if we want to get into the secret sauce of Alibaba, the Tao of Alibaba, I also break that down in the book. And the Tao is a very sort of philosophical concept, but if I were to break it down into three sort of key words, it would really be about the path, it would be about harmony, and it would be about embracing contradictions, or what I call the dialectics. And really, these aspects of the Tao, how the company really set a path and had a mission that really permeated the entire organization. This drove much of what the company has done and does today in terms of its strong mission. The harmony aspect is really about how Alibaba adapts and fits within its environment, whether it's the domestic market or the global market as a whole, and how it really sort of adapted itself to fit those conditions and circumstances. And then finally, when we talk about embracing contradictions, Jack often talks in riddle when he says things like Alibaba was successful because it had no money, no business plan, no technology. People scratch their head and say, how on earth does this make any sense? Alibaba is the largest e-commerce ecosystem in the world by pursuing the smallest businesses in their economies. So how do we make sense of this? I also break that down in the book and try and use it as a way to help people broaden their minds in terms of the possibilities on how to address issues and think about how to make decisions. If you ask me, Frank, what is the key takeaways from the book? I'll just kind of boil it down to a few. Number one is no matter how we see the market today, or China in context to say America, competitor or collaborator, it's critical to understand how one of the most influential companies in China, one that really catalyzed the transformation of the digital economy, how they think from the inside. That's first and foremost one of the objectives. The second is really understanding this dichotomy of this public-private sort of partnership that really took place. What did the government provide in terms of enabling environment, and what did the private sector provide in terms of creating this ecosystem? And I think there's lessons to be learned from that as well. And finally, for me personally, the realizations that business actually can, you can create an organization that's not just good for doing good business, but also doing good for society. Alibaba, in my mind, represented the best of both, and really left me as a believer that, businesses can have more in terms of their purpose than just maximizing shareholder value. I think one of the things that Jack proved is that entrepreneurship can be one of the single largest forces of good and for change in society. And finally, I would say that having Alibaba, having sort of these examples in front of us, provides a mirror for us as Americans to think about, what are the things that we in America can do better to promote more innovation, to be more competitive, not just within the developing world, but the emerging markets. I spent a lot of my time training entrepreneurs during the last few years of my time at Alibaba, and I can see that there's this growing awareness that there are multiple paradigms and models to approach the digital economy that are being pursued by many of these entrepreneurs in these markets. So that's kind of a summary of the book. Hopefully it's informative, and yeah.
No, that's a great overview, Brian. Thanks. There's a lot of food for thought there. Let me pick out one or two points. Go back to the early days, and look, Alibaba's been launched, but Amazon's in the market. Amazon is in China. What were the set of circumstances that allowed Alibaba, forgive me for saying it, a startup, a company with, as you said, no resources, to prevail in China against Amazon, which is at that time very well established? Take us back to that combat and share with us the secret of success.
Well, sure. I mean, Frank, in those early days, not only was Amazon sort of in the market through its investment in one of the local companies, but there was also eBay. eBay was very early in there with EachNet.
Right.
And frankly speaking, most people thought that was a battle that was already done because of the power and the resources and the know-how of these Silicon Valley tech giants in the China market. But I think that one of the things that really allowed Taobao, which was the e-commerce, the retail business that Alibaba Group launched in 2003, was really, its understanding of the local market and how to serve the actual needs that existed in a market like China versus the United States. A lot of the Silicon Valley companies, while very successful in the US or even in Europe, when they sort of cookie cutter that approach to and applied it to the China market, there were a lot of deficiencies in the market in China that did not really work in the same way that they did in the other markets, specifically things like payment, logistics, even the way that customers interact in terms of communication and exchanging information. I think that Alibaba was really able to create an interface on Taobao that suited kind of the local needs, but also they created a payment system that actually worked for the China market, in a market that didn't have credit cards. They didn't have the sort of infrastructure that they did in the United States. That's what enabled a marketplace like Taobao to succeed, because they localized it.
So one difference, just a mechanical difference, was Amazon, eBay relied on credit card, but something like 1% of China at that time had credit cards. But
Yeah.
Taobao used what, direct withdrawal from bank accounts, direct links to bank payment? Is that the payment system on Taobao?
So, I mean, initially they actually created this, what they call an escrow system that was essentially using these accounts that were effectively wallets, but they had to be charged through either a post office or a convenience store. Like, you didn't even need to have a bank account. What you needed was you had to charge the wallet, and then that payment was passed to an escrow that was managed by Alipay and then released upon receipt of the product and approval of the buyer. But there was a very low trust environment in China back in 2003, 2004. It was a cash-based society. Who on earth would be willing to send money digitally or through the internet without actually meeting the individuals they're doing business with? So effectively, what Taobao, with the help of Alipay, which was at that time very much linked to Taobao, the marketplace, they created this culture of trust. And actually, that wasn't done just virtually. They actually had a lot of offline trainings, meetings, and interactions with merchants and consumers, the buyers themselves, in order to build the understanding of what was actually e-commerce, and then to build an understanding of or a level of comfort in terms of the trust that was being done or that existed within that community. So effectively, a lot had to be, a time and resources had to be invested in just educating the market before this kind of e-commerce ecosystem could really take off.
And did Amazon and eBay just not see this coming? I mean, it strikes us now looking back as, absolutely the right move. But you're saying Amazon just took this U.S. cookie cutter approach and parachuted into China and said,
Look, I mean, I had a lot of friends who were at the companies at the time, friends from Silicon Valley that moved to China, and we talk about this. And I think it was sort of like watching a slow train wreck, about to happen. They saw that the things that they were trying weren't exactly being as effective as they would hope. But also there was this sort of difficulty in terms of the decision-making process. A lot of it was centralized out of the United States. Wow. And any decision that was proposed locally had to be approved at headquarters. That slowed down the process. And at the same time, when you have a local competitor like Taobao that was so aggressive and so innovative, in effect, you're just moving at half the speed or a fraction of the speed while your competitor is running circles around you.
Let me take that point and touch on another comment you made in your opening remarks, which is, look, you were the first American hired at this Chinese firm, 100% mainland Chinese firm. You previously had, I would say, pretty good work experience for your age, but it was 100% with Western firms. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, yes, they were Western firms, but some of the firms, I mean, I was based in Hong Kong for a period of time at a consulting company, but I would say that the frameworks, the thinking process was very much American or Western, which, in a lot of ways kind of helped shape my initial views on what business should be like.
Right.
Yes.
Well, but this leads to the question, because when I think of Chinese decision-making, I think of consensus-oriented institution and top-down institution. But what you're describing is actually a very agile institution, a very
Yes.
adaptive institution. So was this Jack Ma's personality, or how did Alibaba escape from that kind of traditional Chinese rigidity and really become a nimble company?
I think you're right, Frank. A lot of it had to do with Jack and his personality and what, his approach to management. He was a teacher first and foremost. And if you think about what teachers do, they generally try to empower their students to be successful and to learn and to develop. And I always felt that Jack, in terms of the interactions he had with me and many of the staff, was really about trying to encourage us to become the best that we could be as individuals and work towards a common goal. So it wasn't about command and control. It was about enabling and supporting, and then directing towards that purpose or that objective, and allowing, frankly, for failures. If you made a mistake, sure, everyone would say, look, this isn't right. We need to do this better. However, let's try again, or let's take a different approach to it. And I think that sort of environment, and I'll note that many of the early employees, including the founders, were actually Jack's former students. So it's not a coincidence that kind of culture still existed, because in a way he sort of carried that over from maybe, the classroom environment into a company. And, tech companies, they need to have sort of that constant learning ethos in order to regenerate themselves, in order to grow. They can't be static. And so I think that really created the right environment.
And what would you describe Alibaba more as a retail or consumer company, or more of a tech company? Is that relevant to the previous question, that consumer-facing entities have to adapt because they have to understand the market and what consumers want, but tech companies say, look, I've got this app, I've got this widget, and you're going to love it?
Yeah, good question. I would say it's very much the former. It's a consumer-focused company where technology is really a tool to serve those needs. Jack used to talk about how today it's the internet, tomorrow it might be something else that really helps us to solve these society's problems. And so, when we started out with Alibaba.com, I remember scratching my head because, coming from kind of the Silicon Valley world, and you think about internet, you're thinking immediately about scalability. And one of the things we did with these China Gold suppliers, which are basically these paid suppliers that were trying to promote their products and services internationally, we would actually go, so they asked me to develop a product. And I said, okay, I'll develop a do-it-yourself, a DIY website builder where the actual small, medium-sized businesses can build their own websites, and then we help them promote it. That seemed like a very wise and scalable type of model, instead of having individuals talk to individuals door to door. That did not work, because these owners of the small businesses, these factory managers, they had no idea what the internet was, let alone they could barely check email at the time. They didn't even know how to respond to emails. So what the company ended up doing was going door to door. They had a large sales team, thousands of people eventually, that would literally go door to door, try and sell this website product to a factory boss, and sit down with them and explain it point by point what this product was. And then we would manually build these websites for them. Doesn't sound like an internet company to me. It sounds like a very rudimentary, basic services company, right? But that's how Alibaba.com became the first company to go public within the portfolio. It was a $10 billion company built off of a sales team and customer service, not technology.
That's very interesting. Let me just interrupt our conversation for 1 minute to speak to the audience. Brian and I are going to keep this conversation going for a few more minutes, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So please enter your questions through the YouTube channel, and we'll have a chance to read them and share them with Brian. We'll get into your points in a few more minutes. Thank you. You referenced in your opening comments the Tao of Alibaba, that there's a special management style. And can you just elaborate on that, what you encountered? And by the way, I want to ask you to key off my previous point about saying, look, you were the first American there. there had to be adjustments or things you learned or things you saw that maybe struck you as odd or even unproductive, but had their own logic, and you could see that they sort of work. But share with us some of the insight, both Jack Ma's philosophy was, and then what you saw as the outsider coming into it, please.
Well, when Jack would often talk, he'd mention this idea of, we are a company that is driven off of Eastern philosophy, but use Western management practices. And I never really understood what exactly that meant. And I would argue that even today, I'm still trying to decipher all that. But writing this book kind of was a good process of learning for me. And, Taoism as a philosophy, or, once it was a religion, is a very complicated philosophy, because when the actual, Tao Te Ching, the book of all of the key sort of texts, starts with the first sentence, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, then how do you describe something that can't be described? It's full of sort of contradictions, right? And so when we were opening this sort of talk, I shared some of the contradictions that I see within the company in terms of its existence, trying to become the largest by chasing the smallest. Jack also would say things like, we use a charitable heart. Alibaba, we use a charitable heart, but use business practices to build the company. And I've always thought charity and business were polar opposites. How do you kind of blend those together? And probably one of the most interesting values that we have today, or Alibaba has today, is really this idea of to live seriously and work happily. Most people think you're going to live happily and work seriously, right? So how do you make sense of all this? Well, you can deconstruct each of these kind of phrases to better understand what it means. But the real essence of this is this kind of dialectic in this process of coming to truth or understanding by looking at the opposites. And what it allowed the company to do, well, it had processes and systems, which were very much a Western practice. The Eastern aspect of it is really about how to be fluid and be able to adapt within these polarities. And so that, I think, is what gives Alibaba the flexibility and the adaptability to change itself. And it's just like that saying, be like water, flow like water. That this company has the ability to really change based on this dynamic. And so that's when we talk about contradictions and paradox, that I think is a key trait of the Tao of Alibaba.
That's interesting. Let me shift again and give you a little more challenging question here. I love everything you've said. No, it's a great story. It's a great history of the company and your personal journey. But the challenging question is this: is the golden moment of growth past us? Is China past peak growth, or is e-commerce past peak growth? To say there's this incredible journey out of poverty into middle income, but once you've made that journey, what's the next chapter? So Alibaba is always part of the China ecosystem, and it's a very powerful platform. But is it past peak growth?
So I think your question, Frank, really gets to a larger question, which is, as a country and as its economy, has it passed that peak growth? And as you know better than I, the whole conversation around this in terms of the government sort of discourse is that China is moving from a period of fast economic growth into a period of high quality growth, right? And what does that mean? Well, there's still opportunities. I think the opportunities in terms of commerce are synonymous with the size of this middle class that exists in China and continues to grow, I might add. And this is something that we cannot deny. It's really a question of then how do you adapt to the needs of this new and emerging middle class that has more demands in terms of the quality of the products that they're looking for. There's more competition domestically within the market. And also investment is probably going to start flowing less in the way of traditional e-commerce and more into things that are more specialized, even areas of hard tech or more sophisticated technology. So no, I don't think that the golden days are over, say, for companies like Alibaba. It's really a question of how can they adapt to this new environment and how can they continue to serve a market that is evolved and matured, using new and innovative tools. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's encouraging. Let me also, you made another reference in your opening comments about rural China, the poorest section of the poorest part of China's economy, both your journeys there and also what did Alibaba do in those rural areas? It's not where we would normally
Yeah.
in the US we think of tech sort of empowers those who have it, but you know, if you're not connected, you're not connected.
Yes.
But tell us how that was different in China.
So one of the amazing things, Frank, that I observed is those areas that you would traditionally think are not able to access technology, either because of a lack of infrastructure or frankly, a lack of skills, were able to connect with this ecosystem that was evolving through Alibaba's e-commerce sort of business. And particularly, one of the amazing things, and I described this in the book, is a visit to a village that actually had gone through a number of iterations. It was in Jiangsu province on the outskirts. The soil of that village was around it was not very arable. So they weren't able to produce crops with much success. They went into pig farming. And then when that wasn't successful, they went into recycling. And essentially all this garbage that was being imported from America, Japan, and Europe would be shipped to China and then trucked over to this village, and those people would be separating out plastic for recycling. It became known as the garbage village. Can you imagine that? So this one individual, his name was Sun Han, actually went off to college. He left the village, dropped out of college, and did a bunch of odd jobs until he discovered, well, maybe I should try and start an e-commerce company. He did some research and ended up stumbling upon this concept after doing research, which was DIY furniture. And DIY furniture, much like IKEA, he started to sell these on Taobao using some local villagers to help sort of build the different parts for assembly. And it became so successful that his business burgeoned, it grew, and he started to get other villagers involved. And today, that's one of the most successful and earliest Taobao village stories, where they employ half the village in e-commerce, and their revenues are astronomical. I mean, the numbers that I've seen from a World Bank report were around $2 billion in this cluster that does DIY furniture. Now, this happened organically. I actually went to that village in 2013 and I visited Sun Han. And this was during a time I was taking a hiatus from Alibaba. And when I saw this, I said, this is an amazing, catalyst for change in the rural areas. And subsequently, this started to spread throughout China. Now there are about 7,000 of these Taobao villages, generating billions of dollars and creating, over 10 million jobs in the rural areas. But I think what's most significant about this is that it's changing a trend where a lot of the migrant labor were leaving villages in the countryside, going into cities for construction jobs, for working at restaurants and whatnot, and leaving the infants and the old people behind. This created a huge drain from these rural regions, a huge sort of problem in terms of caring for people, infants, and the elderly, and putting a lot of strain on the cities. Now people in these Taobao villages are actually going back to the villages to work. They have a high quality of life because they're able to generate income sometimes 5 times what they would normally. And sometimes these incomes they generate are equivalent to a college-educated urban person that is not in e-commerce. I mean, that's the level that this is kind of redistributing the wealth. And to me, that was very inspiring. And that was possible because, number one, the government provided the connectivity through its public infrastructure, internet access. And number two, the technology that Alibaba developed was so accessible that even those with a middle school or elementary school education can actually use this technology to do business in e-commerce. So it's not that you only have to raise the skills, the technology skills ability to make these individuals able to use the technology itself, but you can also lower the threshold of access to the applications themselves. And I think that's one thing that is a very valuable lesson in terms of how China and Alibaba specifically made this technology accessible to all.
No, that's a great story, Brian. Brian, I recall in the same vein, it might have been part of the same Taobao Village program that Alibaba pioneered rural delivery, because you go into the really remote, I mean, we're talking about the bottom percentile or a few percent. Well, they don't have street addresses. They don't have a local post office. I mean, this is these are folks who really are disconnected from the modern economy. But Alibaba pioneered mechanisms for local shops to serve as post office, local,
Yes.
the 7-Eleven equivalent, to serve as the postmaster for these folks and allow it so they could pull these people into a digital economy.
Absolutely. Frank, if I can add to that, I did a trip to Inner Mongolia as well to visit some of these centers. And they become meeting centers of the community where not only they go there to pick up their products, they go there to socialize. And now one of the things in terms of this rural revitalization project that Alibaba is involved with is also providing telemedicine services. So these become actual town hubs that are connected digitally to provide products and services that are more and more encompassing of the needs of those local communities. Because like you said, they're very remote. I mean, it was sub 23 degrees when I was in Inner Mongolia. This was the start of the winter. And people just sit around stoves trying to stay warm, doing nothing, playing cards maybe and talking. But like when you add this element of the digital connectivity, they can suddenly access products that they can never get before. They can sell things and they can access information that will enrich the community as a whole.
Oh no, it empowers just millions of people who had been historically disconnected. So it's a terrific story. Let's do this. Let's do this. We're halfway through our conversation. Let's turn to the audience. We've got a number of questions in. So let me just restate a question for you. This is from Sandra Pan. And Sandra writes, Brian, how did you find a startup like Alibaba to work for? What attracted you to Alibaba and Jack Ma? So we want the origin story.
Well, I feel like Alibaba found me as much as I found Alibaba. I think part of this is serendipity, right? When you're young and you're searching for things, you kind of know what you're looking for. And, being 20 something and clueless and not really knowing what sort of career I was going to end up doing, my North Star was to figure out a job that would allow me to do the greatest good for the greatest number. We've talked about this in the past, Frank. I thought I'd become a doctor and do health care and health policy, right? Greatest number, you could have, work at the WHO or something to that effect. But I was back in Silicon Valley. I had done consulting, and I was thinking there's got to be something more that can connect me with the community and have impact. So I actually took a job in local government. Frank, I know you've done things in diplomacy and Department of Commerce. Like I was just starting small in the city level, and I was enjoying that job working in San Francisco. But Jack Ma ended up coming through in 1999 to raise money in Silicon Valley, and I was very fortunate to be introduced to him through a mutual friend. It was Joseph Tsai, who was the CFO at the time, and Joe was introduced to me through another friend, and they were looking to hire people, and so. We met up in San Francisco. I remember it was at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, and Jack shared his vision for what the company wanted to do. And for me, this combination of technology and development work really seemed compelling. And it was, at the time, internet companies were more portals, it was about information. But Jack wanted to link this to commerce, and commerce I knew could have a major impact on society's development. And I thought that was a very compelling idea. Jack has a charisma that is something that just kind of captures your attention. And within 3 months, I left San Francisco and moved to Hangzhou. So
that's a great story. Let me go to a question from Rayan. What can other countries learn from Alibaba and China?
So I think this is multifold, and part of the reason why I really enjoyed my work towards the end of my time at Alibaba was that there were so many lessons that we learned, including some that we've shared today, but also just this mindset, a belief that you could go out and do these things using technology, despite the fact that Jack and many of the founders didn't have these hardcore technology backgrounds. They weren't PhD dropouts from like Harvard or MIT or Stanford. These were normal people that had this dream and ambition. But they were able to use technology to make that change. China started out very rudimentary. When Alibaba was started, there were 8 million internet users. Per capita income was $800. It was less than 1% of the world's e-commerce transactions. How do you start with so little and create so much? And what I've found, particularly in the emerging markets, when the entrepreneurs come Hangzhou and learn about the story, a light bulb turns on. They get inspired because they see that, hey, if these guys could do this, maybe I could actually do it in my country. Maybe I can do that in Rwanda. Maybe I can do that in Indonesia. And the conditions that existed in China at those times are not that different from what exists in those countries. So I think it's a contrast to kind of the Silicon Valley models, which really emerged from the developed world and very sophisticated technology. Those are inspiring to many entrepreneurs, and they should be. But then here's an example of a developing country that was also able to create something of impact and of scale and of global relevance. And that's what I think people often take away from these lessons that are captured in the book.
No, that's a great story. I mean, to my mind, when I look at rural China, Alibaba empowers people. It connects people. And so even the poorest person or the most remote person or the least educated person is part of the same system commercially that the wealthiest or most highly educated person is. So it's very open in that sense. And you're going to capture a lot of good news if you do that. So yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. Here's a question from Chuck Ng. Given the new political landscape of China, what is the future of Alibaba?
Yes, so Frank, we talked about this a bit. The political landscape has changed, from the time that the company was started. There is a shift in terms of its focus, in terms of the economics and the resource kind of, where resources are being directed. And I think obviously, there's a whole nother political sort of lineup of individuals who are in leadership roles. I think that they've made their intentions and their goals very clear. What I always tell people, Frank, and I think you know this too, is that if you want to know where China is headed, just look at their 5-year plan. This last 14th year plan, 14 5-year plan really lays out how they're making this transition and focusing on new industries like renewables, like green tech, like semiconductors in these areas. And, that just means that this e-commerce space has matured. And now it's a question of how do you make it even more efficient? I think e-commerce focused largely on the marketing and sales aspect and understanding consumer demand because of this data. Now, I think what's going to happen is you have to move into the digitization of the businesses. How do you make manufacturers smarter, more lean, and more efficient in their resource use based on the projected demand? And how do you essentially upgrade the entire ecosystem using this technology and the data that has been now generated as a result of that?
Yeah. Listen, I think the only mistake Alibaba would make is if it said we've got a good model, let's just count on economic growth to keep it going. And I said, then you're stagnating, then you're not. But I think I love what you said about business practices, a lot of B2B improvements. We can see that rippling through. And I think a lot of international connectivity. Through the Alibaba system, people are sourcing from, selling to. So all of that I think is in front of us. All right. Here's a question from Eric Cooper. What's the next chapter in the evolution of US-China trade, and what is needed to take the two countries' trade relations to the next level?
Wow, that's a big question, and maybe even one that's more suited for someone with your background, Frank. So why don't I?
You first.
Yeah. I'll take a crack at this, and then we'll leave it to the experts. Look, I think that one of the great things that companies like Alibaba provides is a window and a channel into China's consumer market that is only going to continue to increase in size, as we talked about. Those needs have changed. Look, I've seen amazing stories over the years in terms of how Chinese consumer demand has evolved, and they're always looking for new things. They're always looking for fresh product ideas, and they have a voracious appetite to consume these things. I remember one year when we started to promote produce and agricultural products from America to the Chinese consumers on things like Singles Day. Over 1 million apples were sold from Washington State. I think these were the Gala Granny apples. 1 million of these sold in a day, right? I mean, that's the appetite. Boston lobsters, cherries, tons of cherries. I think it was 27 tons of cherries were sold in this one promotion. That's unheard of. And I heard like the price of lobsters in Boston went up because there was so much demand from the Chinese consumer. So then that's evolved. Cars now, cars, there were 6,240 cars sold in one day at one Singles Day event. I think it was 2017. That set a Guinness Book of World Records. But, cars now are being sold on Tmall every day, millions of cars. And so that's a very efficient and low cost channel to sell products. And now, what's the new trend? Now it's things like wellness products, health, pet products. The pet industry in China is booming. That's one of the fastest growing sectors in the consumer market today. And then outdoor equipment. There's this whole trend now with COVID of something called glamping. Like everybody likes to go out and kind of be in the outdoors, but comfortable enough so that it's not too harsh. But like everybody's into outdoor things. Skateboards. I think the percentage of growth in skateboard product demands have gone up like 500% in the last year, because that's one of the new trends. So as American businesses think about this trade relationship, I think it's important not to forget that, this consumer market is significant, and there are national security issues and political tensions between the two countries, US and China, and we'll let the experts and the political people deal with that. But when it comes to people, like, Chinese consumers and American consumers, they like a lot of the same things. And why shouldn't we be trying to grow together by continuing that commerce, that exchange, by utilizing technology to sell products?
No, I think that's right on the head. I'd say, look, there's certainly trade issues, but boy, there are all sorts of success stories too. Agriculture, as you indicate, agriculture is a huge success issue. Tourism, pre-COVID, COVID's disrupted that, is a success. Student, educational, we want American kids to go to China. We want Chinese kids to come to America. And boy, consumer goods is an enormous success, where if we look at the numbers, Nike's best year ever in China, Procter & Gamble's best year ever in China, Mercedes best year ever in China. I mean, it's just a mammoth market. And my view is the Chinese consumers like these wonderful products for the same reason we like these wonderful products, because they deliver value, and you get what you pay for. So there's no question there's that appetite in China, very similar. I think you gave some great examples too, to say, look, that market isn't stagnant. That market is evolving. It's in different channels. There's capacity for experimentation. There's a restlessness among consumers. There's always a constituency that wants the next best thing and wants to try something new, and life is to experience and to enjoy. So it's up to the great consumer goods companies of the world to empower those consumers and give them something that lets them have a better life. So I'd say so far so good. So far so good. We're very much on the right track, and just keep a good thing going. Let me turn to another question about the early days. What were the existential issues or challenges that Alibaba faced early on before it got traction and started its meteoric growth?
Well, the company was near bankruptcy, about 6 months away from bankruptcy in the early days. I think it was 2002. And that was a decision that Savio Kwan, the first COO of Alibaba, had to come in and make the call with Jack, obviously. But whether or not we needed to lay off a large number of people, including the international teams. If you've met Jack, he's someone who has a very big heart. He wants to do the right thing, but he also cares a lot about his people. And for him, I think it was a very painful time and decision to lay off staff that had, given their trust to the company and made this leap to join what was a crazy startup at the time. But Savio, being kind of newly appointed, he had to make that call. And so that was a big decision. They called it back B2C, back to China strategy. And a lot of the international staff were laid off. Then some of us were given the opportunity to actually move back to Hangzhou, because I actually at that point was working in Hong Kong, and they made an offer. They say, we'll cut your salary in half, but we'll double your stock options. And didn't sound very appealing at that time. 2020 hindsight, even at today's price, would be very attractive. But so a lot of us left. I went back to business school, and that was an experience that complemented and probably really enhanced my appreciation for what we had done at the company. But that was probably an existential situation.
Let me ask you though, the background to that, was that just over expansion? Was that just too far, too fast, and the market hadn't caught up? And so we had this, Alibaba had this significant cost base, but there wasn't yet the flow. Was that sort of the quintessential over expansion, or was there something beyond that?
Yeah, I think that was definitely this over ambitious belief that we could grow that fast and be able to support ourselves. I think it was also, frankly, we didn't quite have the systems and processes in place that really codified what Jack believed, which was this mission would make it easy to do business anywhere. But we hadn't put it in a structure that would allow us to kind of be so focused that we create a viable business model out of this. We were trying all these different things. And this is what in the book, again, I talk about the different phases of a company or of Alibaba, this trial phase, this, refinement stage, and this kind of development stage. It goes in cycles. And that was the chaos period where you're just throwing whatever you can against the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
But I do think it happened in a way that probably most of the management weren't quite ready for the consequences of that kind of decision. And I think Savio came in and instilled some discipline. And when we finally settled on a business model, then that's what allowed the company to get its feet on the ground and get that traction.
Because Alibaba's got a great global footprint today. I mean, when we deal in our little company with a French cosmetics brand, we'll get a call right away from Tmall in France, the Alibaba team here in France, and it's not just the country head, it's the cosmetics, beauty. I mean, there's a whole team just on cosmetics and beauty. So there's got to be a reasonable footprint just in the French market. So
that was. I mean, this is what, like 2 decades after the fact. I mean, we had like 2 people in London and like 4 people in the US and a few people in Korea. We actually had a joint venture in Korea at that time and a bunch of people in Hong Kong. So we were global, but we were also still very sort of rudimentary, and we didn't have a business model that was, viable at the time. Yeah.
Okay. One more question from Bing. How do you think your experience of working for Alibaba has changed your perspective on how to do business in China for US companies? What advice would you give US companies in China?
Wow, interesting. Well, again, I don't claim to be the expert because I've had, experience of like working at 2 companies there in China. But I think that what it did say to me is the need to kind of be a bit more open-minded in terms of how to go about, addressing issues and thinking about these issues. Again, that's why I titled the book "The Tao of Alibaba," is to kind of show this sort of more Eastern perspective on how to look at the world and address these issues. I definitely think that it helps to have a local partner as well to kind of help you kind of decipher everything that's happening there. But more than anything is having a very clear purpose in terms of why you're there, what you're trying to achieve, and then enabling your own team there on the ground to do what they need to do in order to work towards that common goal. And I think young people in China are very capable, very hardworking, very creative. What they need is the space to kind of solve these problems and come up with the solutions, but they also appreciate clear direction and again, purpose in the work that they're doing.
Yeah, you also made a very interesting point a few minutes back where you said, look, the problem to avoid when you're coming into the market is don't use the cookie cutter approach. And we'll have US companies that say, look, we had a very successful, we went to Canada, we did this, and we went to Britain and we did this, and now we're going to go to China. Say, well, wait a second, Canada and Britain have a culture and business practices that might be 90 or 95% identical with America's. So don't, you're learning the wrong lesson. Now you're going to a very different culture, very different business style, operating style, and you really have to have some adaptive characteristics there to understand where the market is and where you're going to fit in. So.
And Frank, I would add, I mean, you're absolutely right on that, and it should be a reminder to us all. But what's interesting is too, I've seen Chinese companies that go global, they make the same mistakes. I mean, even we did at Alibaba, thinking, we're learning from eBay's mistakes in China, but then we go to, Europe or go to, India and we try and apply the China model to India market and it doesn't work. And so I think it's not it's intellectually, it's easy to kind of say this, but then when you're actually in practice, sometimes it requires, a little bit more discipline to kind of hold yourself back.
So some companies are diagnostic and they try to understand the market and get feedback. And some companies just are not that diagnostic and they say, we've got it and here's what we do and we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And, again, that'll work probably going US to Canada. That'll sort of largely work. But boy, in China, you have to say, the consumer behavior is different, purchasing power is different, expectation, even what the product means to the consumer can be different. We can look at everyday example. I mean, I'm always taken by the difference, Brian, if I may digress a minute, about the difference between Anheuser-Busch ads in the US and in China, where you say, well, what's the purpose of beer? The product is identical. It doesn't, the product's not different, but the product, the use of the product is marketed very, where in the US, it's viewed as friendship, that the point of beer is to establish a friendly relationship with someone, and this is how friends talk to each other. They say, let's go get a beer. And in China, at least in the Anheuser-Busch ads, the point of the beer was to signal a success in business, that you have a beer when the transaction is done, and you have a beer as a celebration of success. Now, those aren't radically different ideas, but they're slightly different
nuanced
position, right? So, so the Anheuser-Busch guys have smart people in their team, and they're trying to understand the market and what the point of this product is.
And another thing to point out on that is, the business culture in China is it's about 40 years in existence since the opening, the open door policy. And we think about in America, there's probably over 160, 150 years of formal business management practice. Think about Wharton. It was established in 1881. That's when the first kind of academic institution tried to teach business. So there is actually this, in that regard, despite the length of history in China's, the country and the culture itself, this modern business practices, there's this difference. And that's probably also why people go to China to do business. Like, oh my gosh, how on earth did they come up with this approach? Or, what's this management theory that they're using? I've never heard of it, because in a way, a lot of this is being created right now in China. They're learning from Western practices and whatnot, but there's also something very specific to China that's being created, and I think that's part of the excitement of working in the market.
Yeah, actually, very well said. Let me just ask a general question about your connection with Alibaba. You left the formal business operations of e-commerce and you went into some of the allied undertakings, Alibaba, the Global Leadership Initiative and the university, the campus. Explain what you were doing there and what was the point of these affiliated institutions, still under the Alibaba umbrella, but not directly commerce related.
So it was more under sort of the chairman's office. And these are projects I felt were very important from a more sort of long-term holistic perspective. And part of it was, I think, Jack, as he was preparing for his own retirement, he was seeing that, what is it besides the business, which was being well run by the management that, had been hired and had been building these businesses. He said, what else is there that we can utilize to help improve kind of the world and also promote this idea of, helping little guys, basically helping those who are kind of more on the underserved or marginalized sort of communities. And he felt that entrepreneurship is really the key catalyst and the driver for changing society. And he wanted to share the lessons of Alibaba over the last 20 years with these entrepreneurs. So we spent a lot of our time. So there was two things, actually. One, I spent time helping to develop the next generation of Alibaba global leaders. These are young professionals, late 20s, early 30s, that came to Alibaba, and we shared kind of the culture, the mission, the vision, and all that in a way that was accessible for international team members, and then allow them to go global to the global offices to work. But then we took some of that curriculum and then made it into a program for training digital entrepreneurs from emerging markets like Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. And that was very much a project that we were trying to share our experience, our know-how, and show and inspire these entrepreneurs to do more with the businesses that they were creating, and give them this confidence that, hey, you can actually be a catalyst for your societies, your communities, by building an e-commerce ecosystem in the same way that Alibaba did in China. We didn't try and say you should do it exactly like Alibaba. It was more let them come and see what is possible, and understanding, Jack's whole story and his background. There were a lot of young people who were amazed at what could be done, and also went back and frankly, it transformed their own business. Like there's a fellow named Wilson Bay in Malaysia who was running what we call an insurance tech business. He was an ex-banker, and he was basically trying to do like fintech around insurance. But after going to Alibaba, visiting these Taobao villages, he said, you know what? I'm going to focus on what they call the B40, the bottom 40% of society, and provide them insurance products. Now that sounds like a very money making endeavor because these people have no money, right? But actually what he was able to do is create insurance products that could be sold in little bits, like on a monthly basis at a very low price, to provide gig workers health insurance, accident insurance, and all those street vendors that sell food on the sides of the streets in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, Indonesia. He was able to provide them the same insurance products, and he even got a license to underwrite his own insurance, products for these markets. And now he's the largest insurance provider to this whole segment, and it's a growing business. And that was catalyzed by what he saw during his trip to Alibaba to say it's worth my time to actually go and help these underserved communities and build a business out of this.
That's a great story. Was just to clarify, is the Global Leadership Institute, is this like a fellowship program, or is this a management training program for people who are joining Alibaba? What was the intake of the program?
So the Alibaba Global Leadership Academy was the internal sort of management training program, and then AGI, Alibaba Global Initiatives, was the external kind of outward facing program. And the former, the Leadership Academy, was really bringing in young professionals from all over the world, from the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, and then kind of putting them through a program to really understand Alibaba in a comprehensive way. One of the big challenges for international people that go to the company is it's so large, and it's so, culturally, it's so different. It's like, how do you integrate into an organization like that? So a lot of this served as a foundation for the book, Frank. What you're reading is kind of years of kind of thinking about these issues and trying to frame it in a way that anyone from the West, particularly in America, could read it and say, okay, this makes sense to me.
Let me give you a closing question, then we can wrap up. Given that international orientation and your responsibility there, which country would you say was able to absorb these lessons the best, or which country did digital transformation have the greatest impact outside of China? Where did you see the best results?
I am seeing the best results so far really in Southeast Asia, particularly in markets like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. And the reason is that, Indonesia in particular has a large population, but they have a lot of need to kind of bring the informal economy into the formal economy. They need methods of payment, for the underbanked or the unbanked. And that's really been catalyzed by companies like, Gojek, Tokopedia, and Dana, Bukalapak. They are taking a lot of these examples, these models, and helping to bring this, the mom and pop shops, the vendors, the street vendors and whatnot, into this digital economy. And it's amazing to see that. I think Africa is very much kind of the next stage, but it still has a ways to go in terms of its infrastructure, and also just in terms of, being able to build the fundamentals. Southeast Asia seemed to be kind of one step ahead in that way. So it's been able to really take off. Also, I will add that there's a lot of interest from like Brazil and Mexico, these countries that have been largely within the kind of US purview in terms of thinking about the economic structures. But you realize there's also a very large informal economy that is looking for opportunities. Instead of going through middlemen, instead of going through big corporations, they are looking for ways to reach markets globally through direct connections and using technology.
It's a great story, and everything you just said kind of reinforces your earlier message that this is not just how are we going to transform China and create this middle class and help consumers and entrepreneurs and empower the rural poor in China. But then we can share this lesson. We can share this lesson with other societies and help them as well. And boy, it's been an incredible transformation there. Let me ask you as we close, can you reach behind you and get that book? I want you to hold the book up to the, I want you to hold the book up to the camera. Hold the book up to the lens there. There you are.
Show the Alibaba colors. There you go.
Yeah, good Alibaba colors. This is a great book. This is, I hope everybody's watched today is going to be able to buy the book and read it and reinforce all the points Brian's been making. And you were just wonderful, Brian, to spend this past hour sharing your thoughts, your insight, the Alibaba story, the China story with us. So thank you so much for your time. Special thanks to the Asia Society of Texas and the Asia Society of Northern California. Thank you for hosting this and sponsoring this. And thanks to the audience. Wonderful questions and a great chance to join this conversation. So thank you, Brian.
Frank, can I just say one more thing before we wrap up, since the title was Lessons learned and applications kind of US-China relations. I will say as a California kid that grew up here and then went to China to work and then now coming back on this tour, but just reflecting, one of the interesting things I think to point out is how US and China are so interlinked that in a way that this relationship cannot exist without one another, because number one, we talked about the trade and whatnot. It's very synergistic. There's been a lot of good that's come out of the relationship between these two countries and the collaboration. But two is, I think that each one provides a mirror to the other. So one thing I was thinking about, and I'm sorry I didn't bring this up sooner, but when we're looking at China today as a competitor, as an adversary, it actually brings to light the areas of weakness in America's system today in terms of its economy and the structure, or the lack of investment in, say, infrastructure, or how we have to support more technology innovation in different ways. And in a way, while we don't agree with everything that maybe is being done in China, it provides a contrast or insight in terms of better understanding how we go about things. And so I think the same would be true for China looking at America. And so I hope that that's not lost in this conversation. Part of the reason why I wanted to write this book is to give people, insight into what's happening in China through the lens of one of the most influential companies, but then also reflect on ourselves in terms of what we can do better in America to remain competitive and to prepare ourselves for the future. And that's one final lesson that I think we can hopefully take away from this understanding.
Great lesson, Brian. Thank you for that. Open societies move ahead, closed societies stagnate. So that's a great lesson to wrap up with. Thank you. Thank you for spending the hour with us. It's been a lot of fun. I learned a lot. Good to see you.
Thanks, Frank.